final event of the Freestyle Chess Tour is currently taking place in South Africa. Now, freestyle chess, that's Fischer random to you and me. So where the baseline pieces are shuffled by drawing of lots, so the players can't prepare for these games. So that makes life just a little bit more interesting, a little bit more random. I think it's nice to dip into this kind of chess now and again. I don't think it's going to take over from normal chess, but it's an interesting departure. Anyway, there are 8 very exciting players participating in this event. We've got the old warhorse back out again, Magnus Carlsen, 35 years old. And he likes this kind of thing. You know, he's very keen on playing blitz and rapid, and, you know, he's basically said goodbye to classical chess. And then we've got players from the younger generation like Vincent Keimer, Hans Niemann, and Arjun Erigaisi, and fresh from his World Cup victory, Jawahir Sindarov. And I'd like to have a look at one of his games. In fact, Sindarov against Carlsen. And this is really fascinating to see these two, Sindarov, the coming man, against Carlsen, well, I wouldn't say he's past it. Number 1 in the world, certainly at rapid and blitz. And yeah, this is a very interesting encounter, so I hope you enjoy. On the first day of the event, the 8 players played an all-play-all tournament to determine the pairings for the knockout stage. And in the first round, we saw Jawahir Sindarov playing white against Magnus Carlsen, their first game in the event. Now, let's have a look at the baseline. So you can see that the 2 rooks are actually in the corners. So it feels as though there's every chance that this could actually develop into a pretty standard position. And the queens are also in the middle. And it looked like that was going to happen after the first couple of moves. E4, E5. So solid start in the middle. And C3. So this could be a pretty standard kind of position after, for example, knight f6. Let's say d4, d6, knight f3. I mean, you can see with this kind of structure, of course, an incredibly common pawn structure in e4 openings. This could arise from a Spanish, a giocopiano, a filador, a Pietz, all kinds of openings. And it looks pretty normal. You know, this bishop often ends up here in the Spanish or indeed on b1. But instead of that, well, Carlsen loves to take the initiative. And he played d5. So he's challenging that centre straight away. Now, if Sindarov wants to play modestly here, of course, you could just play d3. But really, that would be a triumph for black, because suddenly it's black that has this centre, just a little bit more space, and potentially that gives black some positional advantage. So Sindarov decides to fight fire with fire and takes that pawn. Carlsen recaptures with a check, and queen takes d5. So Carlsen has the space advantage due to this pawn on e5, but in typical fashion, when a queen comes out very early, it gets pushed away. So this is the downside of Carlsen's strategy, that white now has a lead in development, so the knight comes out, threatening the pawn. And then c5 protects that pawn with the bishop. Okay, I think we're going to have our first think and drink moment. So I'm going to have a drink. You have a think. What's best for white in this position? how would you play this? Remember, castling is possible by when there are no pieces in between. So you could castle here with white, and the king and the rook would end up on these squares. So that is a possibility here. Anyway, what would you play? You have a think, I'll have a drink. Cheers. White needs to use this lead in development. If black can consolidate this space advantage with moves such as knight here and knight out to c6, you can see we've got a kind of Marozzi bind position. And if white isn't careful, you can get squashed. And that's why Sindarov broke open the center with d4, which means he'll be able to use this lead in development. And black's pieces are very awkwardly placed. I mean, they're all on the back rank apart from the queen, and that queen blocks the bishop here. So it's, yeah, very, very natural to break out with b4. I'd also say that b4 is a good idea as well. After this exchange, that bishop can come to b2 and put pressure here. So I think both moves are strong. But d4 is sort of very normal, actually. And in order to, well, not to lose a pawn, then of course black has to exchange. Now, that pawn is protected by the queen. So knight f5. So for the moment, Sindarov is a pawn down. However, the knight is really active on f5, of course, supported by the bishop. That pawn is under attack. And it's a bit awkward for black's king already. Knight c6 played by Carlsen, protecting this pawn and taking a piece off the back rank. Okay, what would you do now? Here's your next challenge. I haven't got time for another drink, but what would you play here if you were white? A castling, I think, is very decent because that rook could come to d1. Remember, in Fischer random chess, that's how you do it. The king and the rook swap over and end up in the normal, in inverted commas, castling position. So I think that's a decent move. But Sindarov played b3. That's a very sneaky move. So he's exploiting the fact that the king is a little bit awkwardly placed on f8. That bishop comes out with a nice check. So knight e7 played, which looks normal, but then bishop a3 is a very uncomfortable pin. And how exactly does black get out of this? Castling, well, let's just have a look at castles. Well, that would allow knight takes knight and white has won a piece. Therefore, Carlsen dropped the queen back. So that means the bishop is looking at the knight. And that would, the exchange would certainly ease the pressure. So Sindarov took the pawn on d4. Now, if knight takes d4, well, that knight was protecting here. So the bishop would crash it and check. And bishop takes queen, and basically white is going to win material here. I mean, there's a long tactical sequence. Just bear with me. After this. And knight takes, but basically white is going to end up material ahead. Let's go back. So Carlsen exchanged off one of the knights. That was replaced by this one. And, white is still looking really good here. That pin is deadly. Castling's still not possible. So g6, putting the question to the knight, and that was exchanged off. So we're getting more like a normal position now. Bishop e4. Well, that is an absolute hammer blow. And you can see White's bishops are so powerful here. They're just cutting across the board like laser beams. And already, Carlsen is defenseless. So the pawn on b7 is threatened. And of course, that would be immediately decisive because the rook would be trapped. And, well, what do you do about that? I mean, if queen d7, protecting the pawn, well, not very difficult. You keep attacking things. Attack the queen. Got to keep hold of these two pieces. And then queen f3. Very simple. This pawn is disappearing and, well, there are so many threats in this position. You know, you can turn your attention to the king as well. I mean, it's an absolutely horrible position. So Carlsen played bishop d6. It's really the only move. But rook d1 is another deadly pin. So Carlsen had to give up his queen. He's got a rook and a bishop for it. But that's a pawn. It's a very useful extra pawn. And both sides castled. The technical phase begins. It is, as they say, a matter of technique. Okay, so first of all, this bishop was brought back into the centre and hassling the knight, which moved into the middle, and queen c4. So white is very stable. Rook e8, threatening the bishop, and bishop d5. Right. This is a weak point in the position, so Sindarov has lined up against it. A traditional weakness on f7. A check with the knight, the king went in the corner, and a rook e7. And that allowed another tactic. I mean, there was no defense against this. Bishop takes f7. Of course, if rook takes, then queen takes knight, because the rook was defending that knight. So king g7, bishop d5. So Sindarov had won another pawn with that little tactic. So he now has two extra pawns. Of course, one could resign this position, but, well, with the time control, it's 10 minutes for both players, and then I think it's 5 seconds per move. I better just check that. G3, very safe, taking this square away, giving the king an escape square. And there's no need to rush these kind of positions. Best thing to do is just improve your position incrementally, because your opponent can't touch the position. King g2. That's a nice little improvement. The king is completely safe on a light square, on the opposite colour to this bishop. Rook d1. Yep, supporting the bishop. The knight came here. Rook d3, hassling the knight. I mean, if this knight takes here, well, white can turn towards the king. You know, you can start with maybe queen d4 check. You could even start an advance with g4, because after this check, after the check here, then the king won't be able to move out to h6. Yeah, g5, really nice move. And basically, the king is going to be caught in a mating net. So Carlsen exchanged off the bishop. And now Sindarov just played rook d3. I mean, there are lots of moves here. Lots of ways to play. I guess his intention with this move is to put the rook on f3, which guards f2. And then it's possible for white just to pursue the attack again. Perhaps by advancing the h-pawn is a very typical method. But basically, Sindarov has made sure that there are no weaknesses in his position, and then he can concentrate totally on the attack. An incredibly smooth win. I think the problem is, in this kind of chess, freestyle, Fischer random, that if you're playing a fast time control, and let me just check what the time control is. Let me see. just bear with me. Yeah, it's 10 minutes plus 5 seconds. That's the time control. The problem is that if you find yourself in a difficult position at the start, where you've committed to this move d5, then with such a short time control, it's very hard to dig yourself out of this. And yeah, Carlsen went down very, very quickly. And by the time it got to this position, this is already incredibly difficult. But fair play to Javahir Sindarov, who absolutely crushed him. And he had a fantastic day. If we look at finish to one of his other games, so this was against Caruana. Sindarov had outplayed him. And in this position, with black, started the final breakthrough on the king side. And the game went like this. Queen b5, that's a bit of a lunge, hoping to complicate. But although this mate is threatened, Sindarov had seen further, because after this, Caruana resigned. So if bishop takes, then queen g4 check, picks up the rook, simple double attack. And if king g1, okay, you've still got to avoid mate, but you can do that just by exchanging queens, and then black is just a piece up. So a really convincing victory there. And Sindarov also defeated Hans Niemann, and he came out on top after that round robin first day. So by the end, Sindarov had, here we go, let's have a look, 5.5 out of 7, and was the clear winner of that, half point ahead of Levon Aronian. So the quarterfinals will be, let me see, Sindarov against Makhsoudlou, Aronian against Niemann, Erigaisi against Kaimer, and Carlsen against Caruana. Interesting stuff. Fantastic to see Sindarov in such good form, and it shows that World Cup victory, well, I said at the time, absolutely not a fluke. And it shows that he could be a serious candidate when it comes to March 2026 and that crucial candidates tournament. By the way, I've got another live interview coming tomorrow morning, Wednesday, 9 a.m. UK. I know, very, very early in the day. It's the only time the subject of could make it. So I'm going to be interviewing Jan Markos, who's a Slovakian grandmaster, about his new book, Under the Surface. So do join me for this live broadcast. It's an absolutely fascinating book, I have to say. So 9 a.m. Wednesday. See you then.